Hi, I'm Izzy Conn and welcome to Leading Labour, and this, the first of a 3-part mini-series on Tony Blair. For the last year, I've been interviewing senior insiders and experts to understand the stories of each of the post-war Labour leaders. The episodes all look at the same themes. They look at how each leader responded to major political developments, how they managed the ever-present tension between the left and right of the Labour Party, and, overall, how the leaders tried to win elections and bring Labour into government. I'm going to do it a bit differently with the episodes on Blair. As I said, this is the first of 3, and this first part is going to deal with the team, the tensions, and the electoral triumphs. We'll look at where he came from, how he became leader, the rise of the new Labour brand, his 3 election victories, and the key people in his inner circle. Now, let's start from the beginning of Blair's life. So, Blair was born in Edinburgh in 1953 into a middle-class family. His father was a barrister and a law lecturer. When Blair was young, his family lived for a time in Adelaide in Australia before settling in Durham when they returned to the UK. Only a few years later, so early on into Blair's life, his father had a major stroke, which ended his father's political ambitions. He'd been planning on standing as a Conservative candidate in the 1964 election. Aged 13, Blair then began boarding school at Fettes College in Edinburgh. The first guests I spoke to are Jon Davis and Jon Rentoul. Jon Davis is director of the Strand Group at King's College London, and Jon Rentoul has been the chief political commentator at The Independent since 2004, and he famously identified himself as an ultra-Blairite. Together, they wrote the book Heroes or Villains, The Blair Government Reconsidered. Let's hear from them about Blair's school years.
He was an anti-establishment teenager at school. He went to a posh boarding school in Scotland because his father wanted the best for him, and he was a constant rebel. But he was always rebelling within the boundaries, and
with charm as well.
With charm, I mean, the teachers found him infinitely frustrating, but also quite entertaining. And so, he just sort of trod the line. Although he was never really interested in politics, he didn't do any politics at university even. But that side of him, the sort of the side that leant to the left, to compassion and to changing the world in an egalitarian way, that was always there.
Next, I spoke to David Blunkett, who was a huge figure during the Blair years, and he served as Home Secretary from 2001 to 2004.
A downside for Tony was that he was never seen as being core Labour. He'd been brought up in a different environment. His schooling had been different to not former traditions, because Clem Attlee had gone to private school. Harold Wilson sent his children to private school, but the immediate image of the 80s and 90s, it's very strange to say so, but people had a view of party leaders which was actually out of kilter with the historic reality.
Blair studied law at St John's College, Oxford, but tragedy struck during his time there when his mother died after a 5-year battle with thyroid cancer. In 2003, Blair's older brother Bill reflected, "From Tony's perspective, I believe it was a combination of things that gave him the drive to succeed. Her death affected him every bit as much as our father's stroke." Blair went on to qualify as a barrister and worked in London. I asked Jon Davis and Jon Rentoul how they think Blair's legal career impacted his approach to politics.
I've always thought that there's a very, 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 very apposite point here, that Gordon Brown, never happier as a son of the manse to actually preaching literally to the converted, whereas Blair actually always wanted to go and persuade a jury of people, of skeptics, and you put that all together. The legal career actually leans very heavily on Blair's approach to government.
Blair had joined the Labour Party after graduating from Oxford and became involved in local politics in London. He was particularly inspired by his pupil master Derry Irvine and by his girlfriend Cherie Booth, who came from a Labour family. He became the MP for Sedgefield in County Durham in 1983.
And I've always loved that Blair line about he wasn't born into it, but he chose it.
Yeah,
So actually,
was that true though? I mean, obviously he wasn't born into it because his father was a Tory, but he was essentially a rebel. He was of the left from his teenage years.
Yeah, maybe. But even at that time, people rebellious could easily have found themselves, and did, in Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. I think that line about choosing it, I've always thought that there was something quite deep in it, and that he was in effect saying that he understood the madness of the Labour Party and still chose it.
Yes.
As we heard in the episode on Michael Foot, under his leadership, the party had gone significantly to the left, and in 1983, only 209 Labour MPs were elected. Blair became friends with other newcomers in Parliament, and his relationship with Gordon Brown, who had also been elected for the first time, was really important from the start. Here's Jon Davis and John Rentoul.
I think that the fact that both Blair and Brown, who were, for all of their differences later, were pretty much, the same in 1983. You add in around that time as well Peter Mandelson, and you can just imagine, having a drink, having a cup of tea, and just moaning about how they saw the chances of Labour at the next election or for the future. What you've got is like a triumvirate there who were dissatisfied, had ideas, were TV-genic, were articulate, really quite clever, in a Labour Party that was still grappling with the modern world.
Always imagined Tony Blair coming to Parliament in 1983, surveying the wreckage of the Labour Party, looking at the sort of stragglers left behind by the cataclysm, and thinking to himself, well, it won't take me long to get to the top of this lot.
When Neil Kinnock took over, after Foot, he made both Blair and Brown shadow ministers, recognising their talent in the small group of MPs. Andrew Grice, who was working as a political columnist at The Independent in the 80s and later became political editor, knew Blair and Brown at the time.
I got to know them when they were junior frontbenchers soon after they entered the Commons in 1983. They were effective, articulate, and quickly learnt the art of how an opposition can get under the government's skin. I saw a lot of them after they won promotion to the shadow cabinet. I remember thinking that Gordon Brown was the senior partner in their double act. He had more experience and deeper roots in the party. I would often ask Blair a tricky question during our regular chats, and if he wasn't sure of the answer, he would tell me to go to the office next door and, quote, ask Gordon.
Let's hear John Rentoul's view of Blair and Brown's early relationship.
The portrayal that's often seen of Tony Blair as the sort of shallow PR person and Gordon Brown as the deep intellectual thinker, I think, is complete travesty of the truth. Actually, they both had a very, very good and deep understanding of politics and how it worked, and brought different strengths to that understanding. But Tony Blair was the better politician in the end, and I think he understood that.
This time was a really difficult era for Labour to be able to cut through against Margaret Thatcher at the height of her powers. But there were two key issues on which Blair's capabilities shone through. The first was when he was the party's spokesman on employment.
It was a sort of trade union restrictive practice, and the EU had decided that it was contrary to the rules of the free market, and so it was saying that it would have to be abolished. And so the Labour Party had to decide what its position was. And Tony Blair obviously thought, well, we've got to get rid of this closed shop. We're not in favour of it. And he discovered that he had the communication skills to be able to sell that message, not just to the public, but to his own party, and impressed a lot of people in the party as a result, including Neil Kinnock.
The other moment was following the murder of James Bulger in 1993. As Shadow Home Secretary, Blair called for Labour policy to be tough on crime and tough on the causes of crime.
Tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which, as you know, in many respects, in many people's eyes, made him. And that there was this sense of a broken social fabric in the UK, and that Blair understood it, but he was tough on it as well. And so you really couldn't pin on him the usual dichotomy, Labour, soft on criminals because of where they come from, and the Tories too hard, and it was just beautiful the way he just sailed over these two dramatically different positions.
While he was initially associated with the soft left, Blair said that over time he came to see practical, common-sense progressive politics as indispensable to effecting political change as opposed to talking about it. In 1992, Labour lost their fourth consecutive general election, and the party were devastated. As we heard last week, John Smith took over as leader following Kinnock's resignation. Next, I spoke to Sally Morgan. She became a key member of Blair's inner circle, working in various key roles, including Downing Street Director of Government Relations.
So after 92, I knew Tony. I got to know Tony. A group of us met, really thinking about where should the Labour Party be going to maximise its chance of winning. Never thinking at that point that he could be leader, actually. It was just a network of people.
When John Smith died suddenly in 1994, Blair and Brown were both forerunners for taking over. Here's John Rentoul and Andrew Grice.
Almost his sole job during that leadership contest, following the death of John Smith, was to try to persuade Gordon to come to terms with the fact that Tony Blair was better than him. Obviously rather difficult psychologically if you've got that sort of basis of friendship over all the years. And I think it's a tribute to Blair's interpersonal skills that he sort of pulled it off. I mean, Gordon Brown obviously smouldered with resentment for the rest of his political career, but Tony Blair managed that all the time.
When the leader, John Smith, died in 1994, Brown thought that he should be the new Labour candidate, but many modernisers thought Blair would play better with the voters. They were never going to stand against each other.
Blair, Shadow Home Secretary, and Brown, Shadow Chancellor, met at the Granita restaurant in Islington and, according to most, struck a deal which became known as the Granita deal. It resulted in Brown stepping back from the leadership race, though what was agreed is still contested. Brown says that Blair offered him control over economic and social policy and promised that if elected as Prime Minister, he would stand down in the second term, paving the way for Brown to become leader. Jon Davis and Jon Rentoul discussed the Blair view of the deal.
The whole idea of a Granita deal as well, I mean, there's a great deal of scepticism over it. I mean, Gordon wanted it to sound like this huge moment of divvying up, how a government is going to actually be orchestrated. I'm sorry, I don't buy it.
Whatever the exact truth of the deal, this was the beginning of the resentment between Blair and Brown, which would continually cast a shadow over Blair's time as leader.
There was something unusual about Bambi Blair, right, at this time, that people were missing. He was ruthless.
Absolutely ruthless and determined. But should he have dealt with Gordon differently is one of those questions that will never be resolved, because it wasn't, it didn't work out terribly well. But on the other hand, Tony Blair was in power for 10 years and Gordon Brown followed him, and so it kind of worked out for them both.
Blair stood on a promise of clear and visionary leadership. In the leadership campaign, he said, "What is desperately important for the Labour Party is to set policy within a clear vision and a political and intellectual framework that allows the Labour Party to move forward." He continued, "You construct your compass and your destination, and you put up your signpost before you launch on your journey. You don't simply go off down the first path you can see." Blair was elected leader, standing against John Prescott and Margaret Beckett. He won with 57% of the vote. John Prescott, from the left, became deputy leader. Next, I spoke to Polly Toynbee, who has been a leading political journalist at The Guardian since 1998. Let's hear from her, Andrew Grice and Jon Rentoul on Blair's election as leader.
The party's always split between the left and right, and Tony Blair was seen as being on the right. I think seen as being quite a bit to the right of John Smith. Tony Blair arrived looking quite new and looking to be something new and looking to change the Labour Party altogether.
He was a new broom and he had the X factor, and he certainly showed that as soon as he became leader. He was prepared to do whatever it took to win power in the country. If that meant taking on his own party, then so be it.
He himself had no ministerial experience. As he says, the first and only job he had in government was Prime Minister.
Very quickly, Blair set a new direction for the party, stating his intention to redefine democratic socialism for the modern age. He felt that Kinnock had lost in 1992 because he was still tied to out-of-date policies. Blair and those around him had been really inspired by Bill Clinton, who had been elected President of the United States in 1993. He'd brought the American Democrats onto the centre ground and renamed the party the New Democrats. I interviewed Eunice about the changes that Blair made to Labour. She's a professor of politics at Richmond American University, London, and she wrote a book on the ideas that underpinned Blair's leadership, called The Blair Era Under Examination.
When Blair becomes leader, the Labour Party is already a party that accepts the neoliberal consensus. And so it's the neoliberal consensus not only of Margaret Thatcher, but it's the neoliberal consensus that it's part of the European Union. It's about greater competition, a much more modest state for the role in the economy. It is about fiscal responsibility. It is about flexible labor markets. So it's about releasing the power of capital and weakening the power of labor. Blair had a different attitude. He believed in it. He thought, well, this is what we have to do.
Let's hear from Neil Kinnock, who led the party from 1983 to 1992.
I don't blame them for accepting the movement of the tide. They would have had to be pretty fundamental in their ideology about capitalism and qualifying and civilizing capitalism to have recognized it. And they did a lot of great things that were, on a monumental scale, a repair of Thatcherism.
The new policies were called the Third Way, a centrist approach that aimed to combine free market economics with social justice.
There was a minimum wage, yes, but it was set at the level that was acceptable for business. Tax credits was extremely important for New Labour, but in a sense, tax credits are about subsidizing low wages. It is essentially telling business that you can continue to pay low wages to your workers because the state will subsidize, will make up for the difference, and will enable those workers to live dignified lives. So there was that acceptance of globalization, the globalized market forces, the acceptance also of inequality. So there was a very strong concern with poverty. And New Labour did a lot to reduce, in particular, child poverty. But there was a certain acceptance of inequality. And this was very much part of the mindset. Peter Mandelson famously saying, we are very comfortable in the company of the filthy rich, provided they pay their taxes. Tony Blair saying, it's not my burning ambition to tax the David Beckhams of this world. So this was part of the mindset of New Labour, so that you don't tax aspiration and success.
This change and modernisation was attractive to voters.
The idea of triangulation, the idea of not left, not right, but somewhere else, because most voters don't really like to represent themselves as being of the left or of the right. People prefer to think of themselves as being somehow above that definition or somewhere in the middle, apart from hardcore left and rightists. So it was a clever move because it seemed very inclusive, and I think it caught on as an idea, not left, not right, but triangular.
Blair's core team, known as his inner circle, were hugely important to his success. He said, "My core staff were an extraordinary group of people, very different in character and outlook, but knitted together like a regiment, imbued with a common purpose and with a camaraderie that had a spirit of steel running through it." Here's Sally Morgan, who Blair credits with being able to reach parts of the Labour Party that he struggled to.
We didn't go in as big mates or anything. He put together a group of people who he thought he needed, I think. And he didn't want identikit people. He didn't want yes people. He wanted people who would sit and say, "Oh, I'm not sure about this." So part of what I was doing was essentially saying that is just too far. I can't bring people with, we can't bring people with us. It became a very, very trusting and strong group of people to whom he in a sense, not exactly delegated. He trusted you to get on with stuff. He trusted our judgment, but he trusted us to get. We weren't constantly running in and checking things, and essentially we were so clear about what it is he was trying to do, that we played complementary roles in that and ended up, we just worked together extremely well, regardless of our titles. In a sense, we probably overlapped on bits, but we all brought something to the group, I guess.
Let's hear from Jon Davis and John Rentoul on Blair's most key advisor, Alastair Campbell.
I don't think that you can avoid the idea that that Alastair Campbell was the key person. The way that Campbell subsumed his own political feelings, beliefs. A lot of people would say that he's more old Labour than new Labour. But there's one thing that he believed in. It was a Labour government and a Tory opposition. There is no Monday to Friday, 9 till 5 for Blair with Campbell. It is truly 7 days a week, and it is all the hours that they are awake. And this is not text, this is phone calls. Within a year, it's March 98, if my memory serves correct, that he first writes in his diary, "I think I might want to go." And he lasts another 5 years, where Blair was very, very clever at keeping him on side, because Campbell was that important to him. Yeah. Yes, he was like the master media man, of course, right? But it's much more than that. It's around the things where Blair says to him, "Brown's coming for me. The only person he's frightened of is you, Alastair." Yeah. So Alastair's like a bodyguard, but he's also his mate, who's on the same wavelength. They were so close. And I think that those first 6 years being in Downing Street, Blair was blessed to have Campbell next to him.
Brown, who obviously became Blair's shadow chancellor, and his senior advisor Ed Balls, were also really important in being hyper-focused on showing that Labour could be trusted on the economy.
And also, I think we do have to give at this particular point a great deal of credit to Gordon Brown and Ed Balls. Folk memory of 1979 lived on in terms of a concept that Labour couldn't handle the economy, that Labour were abject, they were amateur. And what you had with Gordon was a man who's he probably his best facet is being able to say no, and you believe him, and in that shadow cabinet, where people are saying, "We want to spend more on healthcare," no. "We want to spend more on education," no. But then all with the aim of giving Labour, maybe for the first time ever, a true credibility over the economy.
Significantly, Blair rebranded the party as New Labour, with the tagline "New Labour, New Britain." It basically showed outwardly the changes to party policy that Blair wanted to deliver.
The New Labour branding was tremendously effective. It really did feel like a leap out of the past, a leap away from the failure of losing election after election, all of those years where Thatcherism had been such a dominant force, and Labour had failed and failed again.
Alastair Campbell recently showed me, he found some old pieces of paper where he'd been writing some notes. And it was, he thinks it was the first time the phrase "New Labour, New Britain" was actually written down in writing. And it's such a simple phrase, isn't it? Lots of people claim to have thought up the idea of New Labour, but New Labour, New Britain was the slogan on that Labour conference in 1994. Very simple idea, and it was Alastair Campbell.
Let's hear from David Blunkett, who at this time, when Blair was the leader of the opposition, was Shadow Education Secretary.
Tony was seeking to create a new image, and that was described as New Labour in order to differentiate it from the Labour Party of the immediate past. I think the challenge for Tony was to be able to describe what Labour stood for, what values over and above the normal description of prosperity and justice going hand in hand, which was really to say, if we're going to protect and deliver effective public services, we're going to have to reform them. If we're going to compete in the global economy of the world of today, we're going to have to radically change Britain's place, both in the world and its ability to compete by investing in education and skills, by reforming the way in which businesses operated, and to be supportive of innovation and enterprise.
For Blair, a key part of modernising the party was the removal of Clause 4 of Labour's constitution, the clause which committed the party to aim for full common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange. We've heard about Clause 4 before in the series. Hugh Gaitskell had tried to reform it after the loss of 1959, and Neil Kinnock had also tried and failed to amend the clause. Blair saw that removing Clause 4 would truly demonstrate what new Labour represented. Here's Sally Morgan, John Rentoul and Polly Toynbee.
When he became leader, he was really clear that, for want of a better word, he was a leader who would modernise the country, and therefore part of that was obviously saying to the party, we need to shift. So changing Clause 4 was emblematic of that. Didn't really, I mean, these things don't actually mean a great deal in truth, but it was absolutely emblematic.
And the Clause 4 debate, I mean, hugely significant symbolically, and in terms of sending a message that the Labour Party had changed and allowing Tony Blair to call it New Labour rather than the Labour Party. But the actual mechanical changes were less than Tony Blair pretended, to be honest.
Not many people knew about it. Probably lots of people in the Labour Party had kind of forgotten about it. But it was one of those milestones. It was a marker where he could prove he was turning the party around. It was becoming his party in his image.
The party membership essentially more than doubled. So lots of people joined the Labour Party who hadn't been in the Labour Party before. So the nature of the Labour Party changed.
I think it was a marker, more important for its symbolism than its actual wording.
One of the most controversial relationships that Blair built in opposition was with Rupert Murdoch, who owned The Sun, The News of the World, The Times and Sky. Labour had been shaken by the media treatment in the 1992 election, and the way that the media treated Kinnock in particular. And it convinced Blair and Alistair Campbell that winning over the press, especially powerful outlets like those owned by Murdoch, would be crucial. Let's hear from Andrew Grice and Neil Kinnock.
As Blair put it once, he said, it's better to ride the back of a tiger than let it rip your throat out. And this worked. The Sun newspaper came out for Labour at the 1997 election. That was a symbolic moment, even if it was more about Murdoch wanting to back the winner, so he would have more influence over the next government. Arguably too much influence. I remember that Lance Price, Alistair Campbell's deputy in the comms team, said, quote, no major decision could be taken by the government without first assessing the reaction of three people, Gordon Brown, John Prescott, the Deputy Prime Minister, and Rupert Murdoch. That's media power. The other interesting aspect of it was the Daily Mail. Blair thought he could cosy up to the Daily Mail, and it did work for a short time, but then, to quote his own metaphor, the tiger of the Daily Mail started to rip Labour's throat out. It didn't last.
He was more successful than he thought he could be, he and Alistair Campbell, and they actually got the Murdoch press on side. When they made their initial endeavours, I was outraged, and they knew I was, I told them. Then I realised maybe there was some subtlety and sense in what they were doing, and as long as they didn't compromise basics, it might be a sensible thing to do. But I did say to them, sup with the longest spoon that's ever been made, because they will betray you, which of course in the end they did.
By the 1997 election, most key newspapers were supporting Blair, a benefit that Labour had never had before. And, particularly due to an expanding media landscape, Labour in opposition put an enormous effort into controlling the message that the media carried about them. Here's Jon Davis and Sally Morgan.
When it came to media, you can call it manipulation, management, one of the reasons that Blair went for Campbell was because he was so brutal, right? They truly believed they needed to fight fire with fire.
The 24-hour rolling news was a big change for us in the sense that you were feeding the beast. But it also meant that instead of the campaign tour being sort of, a bit on the 6 o'clock news or whatever, you were feeding it all day long. So these reporters had always been going on campaign tours, but they'd been filing for their newspapers, whereas there were also pictures all the time. So I think it affected that. People say presidential. It is quite presidential in the sense that I think it's 97 was the first election, really. I mean, maybe you saw it with Major a bit, but the Tony campaign was almost separate from the Labour Party campaign. So we had big press conferences every day and all the rest of it, and themes of the day. Meanwhile, he was on the road, really. He was carrying the media with him to quite a large extent.
In the run-up to the election in 1997, most Labour politicians were unified behind Blair, even if they disagreed in private with some of the changes he was making.
After losing 4 elections, the 1992 election in particular, when most people thought that they were going to win, meant that everyone was pulling in the same direction pretty much. There were some policy differences, but they were swept under the carpet. It discombobulated, a very favourite New Labour word, that actually, the Conservative government to such an extent that when it came to election time in 97, discipline broke down. Individual Tory candidates started issuing their own manifestos, and that is how you get the greatest majority since the Second World War.
As Jon mentioned, Blair and Labour were helped by Tory difficulties. The Tories had been in power since 1979, and under John Major they had become embroiled in scandals and lost credibility on the economy, which John Smith was able to capitalise on when he was leader before Blair. Blair's electoral strategy, though, was still crucial to Labour's success. And the pledge card was key to this. It was a card that set out 5 promises that Labour would deliver on if they won in 1997.
The campaign demanded certain things, and the campaign demands something where you can do a soapbox or go on the doorstep and try and come up with policies that symbolise the sort of country you're trying to create. And they're a retail symbol, actually, those things, of what you're trying to do.
Let's hear from David Blunkett.
The Conservatives had clearly run out of steam. What had happened with the economic upheaval in the September of 1992 would have dislocated any government, and it really was a truism that John Major's government never recovered from that. And of course, as ever, the Conservatives were split over Europe. So it was a divided party running out of steam, not surprisingly, after 18 years. But I think Tony gave the booster, the rocket booster, in terms of the kind of majority, not just because it was a majority that meant that Labour could have done a lot more in the first term than we envisaged, but also because it meant that it was almost impossible for the Tories to win a second term, the second term parliament. So it almost guaranteed Labour 2 terms in office.
Labour won a landslide of 179 seats, and it felt like a moment of huge change and optimism in the country. Blair had done what only Attlee and Wilson had managed before him, winning an election for Labour.
I think Tony Blair exuded a confidence in his mission. He had the ability to reach out and touch people of different persuasions. He was able to win substantial amounts of support from the southeast of England and London. London is taken for granted and shouldn't be as being a Labour city, but it wasn't in 1997. He had the ability to speak to exude an understanding of how people felt in those marginal seats in terms of their aspiration, their expectation, their view of Britain of tomorrow, rather than the nostalgia of Britain of the past, which has been so often the hallmark of the Labour Party.
This episode focuses on the personality management of Blair's leadership and his electoral strategy. So let's look at his leadership style. Here's Sally Morgan.
He was clever. He worked very hard. He performed well in the House. He was good on the media. So he was a very, very good performer in the broadest sense. But he was also a really hard worker. So he was, maybe it's the barrister's mind, I don't know. He was very across detail, very, very, very across detail, and very demanding of detail. He had a very clear view of what he was of where he was trying to take the country. That meant lots of people working with him, for him, whatever, understood what that meant in terms of policy and delivery. Now, was it all perfect? No, it certainly wasn't. Was it too centralised? Yes, probably. But I think if you end up with somebody who sees themselves as a convener rather than a leader, that's a problem.
Blair's leadership style in office was criticised for being too informal and too presidential, focused on Blair and in some ways sidelining the cabinet. He opted for what was called sofa government, a more relaxed way of making decisions. Let's hear from Alan Johnson, who was a minister in the Blair governments from 2003.
Sofa government really was, instead of going in front when you were a Secretary of State and you went to see the Prime Minister, instead of some big formal occasion with lots of people around taking notes and in the cabinet room, you would occasionally go over there, have a cup of tea, sit down on the sofa, put your feet up. Tony would be there. Sometimes he didn't have socks on, never mind shoes. Actually, it created a better atmosphere.
In 2001, the Blair government was still popular as they prepared to fight the next election. Here's Polly Toynbee.
The 2001 election, I think it was very much a sense that this was only beginning, that there was so much still to be done. Huge changes needed to education, to health, huge investment needed.
Labour won a second landslide majority of 166 seats. Although turnout was down from 71.6% in 1997 to only 59.4% in 2001. It was after the 2001 victory that tensions between Blair and Brown started to become more obvious. These tensions were nicknamed the TBGBs. Here's historian Anthony Seldon, author of books on both Blair and Brown.
Gordon Brown still believes he would have been a very better Prime Minister in 1997, that he was more authentically Labour, roots far deeper in Labour Party's history, that he had far more of an idea about how to transform the British state, and he believed he should have been the Prime Minister. And he set up an alternative power base in the Treasury, which wasn't helpful to the clarity of the overall project or mission, though some fruit came out of the conflict and indeed out of the cooperation.
I also spoke to Jacqui Smith. She held ministerial posts from 1999 and became Home Secretary under Gordon Brown. Here's Jacqui and Alan Johnson discussing the tensions.
It became obvious that there were certain people that would be put into the category of Brownites and certain others who would be put into the category of Blairites, and that might determine which ministerial job you got, assuming you were getting a ministerial job.
I was totally wrong. There was a genuine TBGB problem, and as soon as I got to cabinet, I could see it played out in front of me at every cabinet meeting. And it's a shame, because I admired, respected, liked both men. And if they could have got along a bit better, this was the Lennon-McCartney of Labour politics. And Lennon and McCartney split up, but nothing like the way, they had their rows, but nothing like the terrible drama, almost Shakespearean drama, played out in front of us at every cabinet meeting between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister.
I do remember very graphically when I was in the Department of Health. So this would have been round about sometime between 2001 and 2003, listening in to a phone call Alan Milburn was doing with Paul Breteng, who was the chief secretary to the Treasury, in which he used the immortal words when they were. It was the time when they were thinking about the foundation trust model in the health service, and Alan said, "Well, just to be clear, I couldn't give a flying fuck what Gordon thinks about this." And that was a sort of graphic example to me of the fact that there were, a nice way of putting it might be, tensions within different parts of the government.
I think it reflected quite badly on Gordon mainly, because Tony was the Prime Minister, and the kind of seething resentment that he was Prime Minister came through from, one of the most talented politicians that this country's ever been lucky enough to have in power, from Gordon. I mean, that was a weak point with him. And, I hope at some stage Gordon's going to give a frank account of what happened there, because it was a kind of blot on the landscape.
Here's John Rentoul and Jon Davis.
You needed Gordon Brown in there, I think, as part of the mix, in order just to hold the parliamentary Labour Party together. I mean, the thing is, if Gordon Brown had been kicked out at any stage, he would have been the focus of opposition in the parliamentary Labour Party, and he would have brought Tony Blair's time as Prime Minister to an end earlier. The problem is that Gordon Brown behaved so badly on a personal level that it doesn't justify the policy outcomes don't justify his behaviour. But
as Blair put it, wasn't it, on many occasions in his autobiography, Gordon was brilliant but impossible.
Yeah, absolutely.
From about 2000 onwards, Blair started to claw back all kinds of policy areas, but Gordon is the most powerful chancellor since the Second World War.
Yeah.
I personally, I'd be quite happy with that.
Around 2001, it was tabled that Blair should move Brown out of the Treasury. Here's Sally Morgan and Andrew Grice.
2001, I thought it was time for Gordon to leave the Treasury, and I thought he should have become Foreign Secretary. And that was seriously talked about at that reshuffle, and in the end, Tony didn't want to lose him as Chancellor because he really respected his intellect.
He wanted to do it, and Brown said, no, I'm not going. And the threat then is that Brown walks out. He did not want Gordon Brown to be a focus for internal opposition on the backbenches. There was another plan to split the Treasury. There was a secret plan drawn up by Blair's advisors to clip Gordon Brown's wings by dividing the Treasury into two departments, which is the case in most other countries, including America. But again, Blair hesitated. He was always torn between what he wanted to do for the country and his old personal partnership with Gordon Brown going back to 1983. And he didn't do it. He pulled back from doing it, and Gordon Brown remained as Chancellor.
Let's hear from Polly Toynbee on her overall view of the TBGBs, which was such a big talking point at the time that Blair was in power.
It was a bad error on both of their part that it was allowed to fester on. I'm not sure really what Gordon Brown thought he was doing. He had been a very successful Chancellor. He could have, if he had stuck to that I'm going to be the greatest of all time Chancellors, he would be a hero. Mm-hmm. Instead of which, this determination to get rid of Blair, his hatred of Blair, the bile that flowed between number 10 and number 11 and all of their people, it was utterly destructive of good government.
Now, Blair's final election victory was in 2005. This was after the Iraq War, which we'll look at in detail next week. And morale within the party was low as opposed to the previous two campaigns. Let's hear from Sally Morgan and Alan Johnson.
It was a miserable campaign, actually. The other campaigns were fine and sort of uplifting, really, in a way. It was a hard campaign. It was a bitter campaign and a sort of negative. It was a negative experience, really, I think. So I don't think I think we expected to win, but we didn't really know what the results were going to be. I mean, you never do in an election, actually. But certainly the sunniness had gone, that's for sure, in general, both in the team, but also in the country, I think.
Thinking back to 2005, there were some personality issues. Tony had brought Alan Milburn in as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. That didn't go down well. The TBGBs reared up something terrible over that, and because Alan had a role in the election campaign that Gordon was a bit resentful of, which didn't help.
Labour won, though the majority reduced to 66 seats from 167 that they'd won in 2001. And turnout was still low when compared to most other general elections in British history. Here's Polly Toynbee.
In the end, people were voting not on Iraq. They were voting on the improvements that they'd seen under Labour. Tories still very unpopular with no suitable leader. And so he won, reasonably easily.
The Conservatives had seemed somewhat irrelevant during most of the Blair years. They had had 3 leaders that had failed to cut through, and in 2005, Michael Howard's campaign, Are You Thinking What We're Thinking?, focused on immigration and crime and seemed pessimistic. Here's David Blunkett.
I think the Conservatives had a real problem, firstly because they'd been substantially diminished in a way that they'd never envisaged. So they had smaller numbers in the Commons. They had much less support from the business community because it was fairly obvious that Labour were going to be holding on to office for some considerable time. And therefore, they had the dual problem of not really having a sufficient profile from Parliament outwards, nor the resources that they were used to, and they were demoralised. And nobody should ever underestimate how demoralisation affects a political party.
We're going to discuss the overall legacy of the Blair governments in episode 3 of this Blair series, after looking at his policies and controversies in greater detail. But to finish off this part, where we've looked at the team's tensions and triumphs, here are some reflections by our fantastic guests on the electoral success of Blair and some of the other themes that we've discussed in this episode.
There'd been a great optimism about the Labour government. It was popular. He was popular. It seemed energetic, it seemed young, it seemed purposeful. It was determined to improve public services that had fallen into a bad state of decay under the Tories, where everything had been underfunded.
He hated the Daily Mail, and he had a terrible time at the Daily Mail's hands, but he understood Daily Mail readers in the same way that Paul Dacre, his great enemy, understood Daily Mail readers. And, Daily Mail readers were Middle England, and they were the sort of key swing constituency in the British electorate at the time. And, Tony Blair just wiped the Tories off the map as a result.
It's become fashionable that you two are rubbish, right? And it certainly has. And on occasions, I just retort by saying, are you really saying that Bono can't sing? Are you really saying that the Edge can't play the guitar? Of course, it's more complicated than that. But for me, it's always been my go-to. Come on, Blair has got to be one of the cleverest people ever to be in number 10. He's seriously super smart.
Blair's most important strength was winning all those elections and keeping Conservatives out. For all those years would have been years in which there were more cuts, in which the public realm would have suffered more. So the first thing that any Labour leader has to do is win, pretty much whatever it takes.
Clarity about what he was trying to achieve, and probably broadly bringing in both a team internally, but particularly ministers who, in the core areas, who really wanted to deliver that too.
Strengths were his courage, his steeliness, his determination to change his party so it could change the country. His weakness was that he sometimes took his party and even the voters for granted. There was an assumption that Labour's traditional working class supporters had nowhere else to go, so the party should focus on winning the middle classes, and he was very good at that. But there was a decline in Labour's working class support on his watch, and he sometimes forgot that there is always somewhere else to go. People can decide not to vote at all.
Tony came to the PLP on whatever it was, a Monday evening in committee room 14 upstairs. It was a real occasion. It was always something he had to say, and people very, most anyway, keen to hear about it. Whereas sometimes these meetings can just be functionary, just something to be got through. So no, he was a remarkable leader and a very good Prime Minister.
Thanks so much for listening to this Leading Labour episode on Tony Blair's team, tensions and triumphs. Today, we've heard from Jon Davis, John Rentoul, Andrew Grice, David Blunkett, Sally Morgan, Alan Johnson, Polly Toynbee, Anthony Seldon, Neil Kinnock, Eunice Goes and Jacqui Smith. The links to read more about them, as well as links to buy any of their brilliant books, are in the description of this episode. Next week, we'll be on the controversies of Blair's leadership, so please subscribe so you don't miss out. This episode was researched, presented and produced by me, Izzy Conn, and I also did the artwork on this episode. Special thanks goes to Will Barber-Taylor for editing and additional research. Music is by Rickard Fromm.